As the war in Ukraine raged, 23-year-old Russian Vladimir Popov decided to leave his home country of Russia. He wanted to avoid compulsory conscription into the armed forces. It was not the life he wanted for himself, and his father, Yuri, didn't want his son to risk his life fighting in battle. Because of this, the two of them moved to Egypt. They left behind Vladimir's mother, who remained at the family home in Balashika, near Moscow, and Vladimir's girlfriend, Anastasia. They headed to Egypt's Red Sea coast. They were finding their feet, enjoying the quiet life. Vladimir found work online as an IT consultant. It was the perfect way to work remotely from the comfort of his own home. The arrangement seemed to be working for the young man and his father, but it wouldn't be long before tragedy would strike. On the 8th of June 2023, just months after moving to Egypt, Yuri and Vladimir walked down to the sea next to Dream Beach Hotel at the Egyptian resort of Hurghada. This picturesque town stretches for almost 30 miles along the Red Sea coastline. The location is stunning. White and golden sandy beaches line the turquoise waters. Luxury yachts and motorboats moor up just offshore, and holidaymakers soak up the sun from the comfort of their sunbeds. Vladimir thought he had struck gold by moving to such a beautiful location. He entered the water that fateful day, heading out for a swim that was to be his last. The calm sea was inviting, the air temperature warm, and the water cool. Vladimir swam outwards from the beach in the safe swimming zone. Several other bathers were enjoying the water at the same time. Then there was a shout. Someone had seen something. Everyone's worst nightmare was coming true. Something that we all think about when we enter the water. The clear image of a dorsal fin breaking through the surface. Everyone made a mad dash for the beach. But as Vladimir turned to swim back to shore, he felt a sharp tug on his leg and let out a cry in pain. What followed was a devastating and truly shocking attack. Not often is an animal attack witnessed by hundreds just meters from the victim, but that's exactly what happened to Vladimir. As people heard Vladimir's cries, they stood up from their seats and looked out across the water. Just 20 feet from the beach, Vladimir was being thrashed around by a huge shark. As he was briefly let go, people could see the terrifying dorsal fin circling the young man. Then he was dragged underwater. He fought back, though. He could be seen trying to push the shark away from him, but it was too agile, too quick. It was too powerful. There was a crashing and a bubbling, a boiling of the water as Vladimir was dragged out of sight. The large gray body of the shark arched out of the water. Vladimir's legs were seen kicking in the air above the surface as he was tumbled and turned upside down. He was spun in circles like a washing machine. Then he resurfaced again. Dizzied and disoriented, Vladimir began to make a few strokes towards the shore. How terrified he must have felt, not being able to see the shark, knowing it was somewhere below him, knowing that it was likely coming back for more, circling around his legs before coming in for the kill. The beach was tantalizingly close. He was surrounded in a cloud of red, his own blood pouring into the Red Sea. He made a few anxious strokes forwards. People could see the nervousness in his body language. They could see he wasn't sure what to do, which way to turn. Vladimir could see his father on dry land. He could see the crowd of people that had gathered at the water's edge, but no one was coming for him. "Papa," he cried out, "help me." But there was nothing his father could do. A rescue boat was launched by lifeguards as soon as the attack unfolded. They motored towards Vladimir as he bobbed in the water for a few heart-stopping seconds. Then the shadow of the enormous shark emerged beneath him once more. It hadn't finished with him yet. Its jaws opened wide as it came up from below. It grabbed Vladimir again, this time around his torso, and dived deep underwater with the young Russian in its jaws. Witnesses reported seeing Vladimir's limp and lifeless body resurface again and again as the shark continued to consume him. Over the next 2 hours, the shark tormented the crowd, pulling and tugging at Vladimir's body. It was truly a nightmare for everyone involved. A lifeguard by the name of Muhammad reportedly swam towards Vladimir and another tourist in the water during the attack. He could see the water surrounding Vladimir was full of blood. He could see how torn up Vladimir was. As he had raised an arm, Muhammad saw the man's hand was missing. He almost dropped the body back into the sea when he noticed the shark had torn his head off. The shark also ripped apart the man's chest. Huge bites were missing from the abdomen as well. It was the most horrifying sight he has ever seen. It was clear Vladimir had already passed away, so instead, he focused his attention on a tourist woman who was swimming close to Vladimir. She was in a state of shock, barely able to move. Muhammad grabbed her under the arms and pulled her back to the shore. There she was comforted and tended to by beachgoers. When the shark had had its fill, authorities were able to capture it. They dragged long nets out behind speedboats and circled the shark. It became trapped and was pulled to shore. It was an enormous tiger shark, measuring 10 feet long. Its distinctive markings were visible across its powerful body. As it was pulled onto the sand, its fate was now sealed. A crowd gathered around to see what a killer shark looks like. Then they began beating it, holding metal bars and wooden sticks. Men began hitting the shark repeatedly across its head and face. The shark attempted to get away, its body powerless on dry land. It flapped its tail and writhed around, desperate for water. After both brutal deaths, the tiger shark was opened up. Inside her stomach were some of Vladimir's remains. It was a gruesome discovery. Vladimir's head and several other body parts were inside the belly. But another discovery may have explained her aggressive behavior and the reason for the devastating attack. Inside her were baby sharks. Tiger sharks lay eggs internally, which then hatch inside the mother. The babies survive inside her until they are ready to be born around 16 months later. Marine expert and fellow Russian Dmitry Orlov came to his own conclusion about what happened and why the shark attacked Vladimir. He believed that being so large and heavily overloaded, her typical prey may have been too quick for her. It was far easier for her to hunt humans who were relatively slow and defenseless in the water. However, biologically and ecologically, this doesn't seem to make sense. But Dmitry believed that his tiger shark was no stranger to human flesh. The year before Vladimir's death, a tiger shark attacked 2 female tourists, an Austrian and a Romanian, in the same location. Other experts have claimed that the shark's behavior may have been influenced by the rising sea temperatures of the Red Sea. She could have been migrating to the Gulf of Suez and cooler waters. Following the attack, Yuri spoke of his son's death. He held no grudge against the Egyptian government and remarkably said that it was tragically Vladimir's destiny to be eaten by the shark. An unusual comment, but one that likely made dealing with his son's death easier to handle. Back in Russia, Vladimir's mother learned of the terrible events. Her son had moved to Egypt to avoid a premature death. He had his whole life ahead of him, and now his mother's world came crashing down. After the forensic examination of Vladimir's body and his remains, Yuri was given permission to cremate him and return the ashes to his homeland of Russia, Vladimir's final resting place. As for the shark, authorities wanted the huge specimen preserved. Perhaps it could serve as some form of education for visiting tourists and locals alike. A team of 5 embalming experts took on the task of mummifying the shark so that it could be put on display in the local museum. The Red Sea has been plagued by shark attacks over the decades. Maybe now it is time to do something about them, as overfishing is removing sharks' prey sources such as large fish like tuna. They turn to other potential prey to satiate their appetite. Moving closer to shore, these incredible predators are more likely to attack again than ever before. Perhaps the Red Sea resorts should install shark nets to protect bathers, a tactic that has proved effective in other parts of the world. Following Vladimir's attack, the beaches were closed. The sea emptied as tourists left the resorts. But a couple of days later, the local government deemed the waters safe again. Speedboats and safety divers maintained a presence along the coastline to reassure visitors and to continue to scout for any potential dangers. But how long will it be before people forget about this tragic event? How long will it be before disaster strikes again, before another innocent swimmer meets their terrifying final affliction? The grizzly bear is a fierce predator and should be avoided at all costs. They have been responsible for over 180 deaths in recent years, although the majority of the time bear attacks are very rare. They will usually only attack when they are protecting food, their cubs, or territory, and would rather avoid humans altogether. However, there are some people who intentionally seek them out and enter their territory, like Timothy Treadwell, aka the Grizzly Man. Even at a young age, Timothy had always been particularly fond of animals, and even had a pet squirrel when he was a child. In his adolescence, he had his first encounter with a wild bear while studying them in Alaska, and that's when he realized his true life calling. He stated that he had lost his way at college, and he had fallen into alcoholism and drug use, nearly overdosing on heroin in the late 80s. This close call with death is what motivated him to initially search out bears and make them his lifelong passion. He studied the bears for 13 years and wrote a book from his findings called Among Grizzlies: Living with Wild Bears in Alaska. During this time, the bears became used to his presence, and he was able to touch them and play with their cubs. In his own words, he stated that he had a good relationship with bears based on mutual trust and respect. Following the release of his book, Timothy began to gain some recognition for his work in television and environmental circles. He traveled around the U.S. to educate local schools and appeared on many TV shows to explain his unique experiences with the animals. He even created his own charity with co-worker Jewel Polovec called Grizzly People, with a plan to continue protecting the grizzly bears in their habitat. Timothy was met with controversy throughout his life, mainly due to his interference with the animals. The National Park Service, in particular, were very unhappy and worried with his actions, as they believed that he was disrupting the animals' natural behavior, as well as putting himself at enormous risk. Timothy was also leading unauthorized tours with visitors to take them closer to the animals, something that was never allowed by the parks. He was thought to be reckless, as he refused to install any electric fences around his camps or carry bear spray, stating that bears would never hurt him due to their relationship together. Despite their fears, Timothy did not bring any further protection from the bears, and he would soon find out that his relationship with these bears could easily be broken. In October 2003, Timothy and his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard, visited Katmai National Park in Alaska. They were warned of the dangers of camping in the area at this time of year, as food was scarce and the bears were preparing for winter, eating anything they could to store for hibernation in the coming months. The aim of the trip was to see one of Timothy's favorite female brown bears and wanted to check that she was okay and ready for the winter. Amy was very reluctant to do this, as she was particularly scared of bears and just wanted to go home, but she stayed as she knew how important the bears were to her boyfriend. Throughout the trip, the pair tracked a few of the bears, but Timothy quickly realized that the majority of the bears that were familiar with him had gone into hibernation already, and there were a number of unfamiliar bears. Although he was slightly uncomfortable with the thought of being surrounded by bears that didn't know him, he still decided to stay and set up camp with Amy. On October 5th, the pair were setting up their video camera to get some more footage of the bears. The setup was nearly complete. The camera was on and recording audio, but the lens cap was still in place, providing no visuals as of yet. Soft rain sounds can be heard as Amy prepares the equipment from inside the tent. Suddenly, Amy calls out to Timothy asking him if he's still out there as she can't hear him. Then the screaming begins. Timothy was screaming to Annie to get out of the tent and to escape as he was torn apart by the large 28-year-old male bear. Amy opens the tent and begins screaming at Timothy to play dead to get the bear to leave him alone, which seemed to have worked for a time, as the pair can be heard discussing whether the bear was truly gone yet. In this time, Amy is thought to have approached Timothy to tend to his wounds, which were unknown at this point, but she had to retreat as the bear returned to attack Timothy once again. This is when Timothy begins to panic, as he realizes playing dead is no longer going to work. He begs Amy to hit the bear with something, and she grabs a frying pan to smack the bear in the head. The bear lets go of Timothy's head and instead bites into his thigh to drag him away from Amy. Covered in blood and knowing he has no chance of survival past this point, Timothy begins shouting to Amy, telling her to run away and save herself. Although he struggled, he knew enough about bears to know he was done for. Unlike other victims of bear attacks, he didn't go into shock during the attack and was fully aware the entire time he was eaten alive by the animal that he loved so much. The bear was silent, aside from sporadic growls and grunts. The only real sound that could be heard during this ordeal is the sound of Timothy desperately trying to escape. His screams of agony and the dull sound of his body being dragged across the dirt away from his camp. Unfortunately, Amy still didn't leave. She was frozen with fear and in shock from the horrifying scene. She was already terrified of bears and had just witnessed her worst nightmare. She wasn't familiar with the area, being brought to the park by Timothy, and had no idea how to get back to civilization. On the tape, you can hear her suddenly begin to scream. It was a scream similar to that of a wounded animal, as she realized what she had just witnessed, as well as her situation. Unfortunately, her screams only brought the bear right back to her to finish the job, and Amy was also mauled to death by the same bear. The next morning, air taxi pilot Willie Fulton arrived at Failla Lake to transport the pair out of the area. He looked around and thought he could see Timothy shaking a tarp to get his attention, but when Willie called out, there was no response. He decided to hike up the path, but quickly turned around as he felt like something wasn't right. Once he reached his plane, he turned around and saw something that made his blood turn cold. Through the fog, a large, nasty-looking brown bear was staring at him just aside from the path that he had just followed. He quickly climbed back into his plane and set off, hoping to scare the bear off with the engine so that Timothy and Amy would be able to pass through without meeting the bear. He kept his eyes on the bear and could see him slowly eating something. Willie circled the campsite 15 to 20 times, each time trying to get a better look at the bear and what it was eating. That's when he realized that the bear was eating a human rib cage. Horrified, he called the park rangers and asked them to come and survey the area, as he believed something had happened to the bear. A group of rangers arrived and began to trek up to the campsite, with Willie guiding them. They spotted a couple of bears on their way up, but as the bears ignored them, they continued without an issue. Suddenly, one of the rangers shouted, "Bear," alerting the others to the animal about 20 feet away. They began shouting at the bear in an attempt to scare it off, but it soon became clear that it knew they were there, was not threatened, and was actively stalking them. They all began shooting at the bear, firing a total of 21 shots between the three rangers. They didn't stop shooting until the bear was shot dead. They continued to the campsite where they found Timothy and Amy's 2 tents collapsed and torn, with a large mud pile at the front of the entrance. The rangers moved some of the mud aside and found Amy's body with her fingers pushing through the dirt. She had been buried by the bear, ready for winter. When they moved the rest of the mud aside, she looked as though she was peacefully sleeping, except for the clear fact that she had been almost entirely eaten by the bear. They were horrified but determined to find Timothy, although the hopes of him being alive were fading fast. They combed the nearby area and found bits of him scattered all around the forest. His head was found attached to a piece of his spine, with a horrific grimace on his face, capturing the pain in which he died. His right arm and hand were also found lying nearby, his watch still attached. It was a gruesome scene to find. As the rangers were discovering the bodies, another smaller bear attempted to approach them. He was approximately 3 years old and was stalking the team from 30 feet away, making it clear that he would continue to approach and attempt to attack them. He was swiftly shot by the Rangers, who didn't want to take any chances given the situation they were in. Once Timothy and Amy's bodies had been extracted from the park, the Rangers sent the corpses of the large bear to be investigated. A necropsy was conducted, and it was found that the bear had human remains and clothing within its stomach, concluding that this was the bear that had killed and eaten the couple. The younger bear had already been cannibalized by other bears, so we will never know if it had anything to do with Timothy and Amy's deaths. Ultimately, it's important to remember to respect wild animals and give them the space that they deserve. Even if bonds are formed with the animals, you never know what might happen, or what else might be lingering in the forest, waiting for the chance to bring you to your horrifying final affliction.
It was Sunday, November 29th, 1964. While the usual crowd fancied a day off from working or doing any exciting activity, Henri Bource and his friends were planning on visiting the ocean. Not that Henri was part of the usual crowd to begin with. After all, he was a keen underwater photographer if he was not playing with his saxophone as the lead for a Melbourne-based rock and roll band. The man could do it all, it seemed. So when he had an idea, nobody told Henri he couldn't or shouldn't do it, not even his girlfriend, Jill Ratcliffe. So when Henri planned on visiting the ocean, it was far more riveting than simply dipping one's toes in the beaches of Australia. Filming seals on an ancient and remote island off the coast of Victoria and spearfishing in the surrounding waters was what Henri had in mind on a typical Sunday. Henri prepped with his team to go to Lady Julia Percy Island, a remote offshore volcanic island located 22 kilometers from Port Fairy. Formed some 7 million years ago through violent underwater eruptions, the island was separated from the Australian mainland as the landmass parted ways with Antarctica. The surrounding water on the island is 30 to 50 meters deep. Strong waves are broken up by the sharp rocks on the shores. On the southwest end of the island lay vertical cliffs, rocky coves, shore platforms, and ancient sea caves filled with oceanic critters and mysterious caverns. Interestingly, Lady Julia Percy holds the largest breeding colony of the Australian fur seal. Additionally, the isolated island provides habitat to seabirds that are rare even by Australian wildlife standards. However, where there are fur seals, there is also one of its natural predators, the great white shark. Unbeknownst to Henri and his friends, this would be the day that would change their lives forever. The Victorian Aqualung Club, where Henri belonged, and members of the Port Fairy Manta Skin Diving Club left Moyne River Wharf on board a commercial shark fishing boat. The filmmaker wore a black hooded wetsuit, something that was not uncommon in those days. Eventually, the two groups arrived at the shores of Lady Julia Percy Island, where they were to begin exploring the area and film seals. Parking the boat a few meters off the coast of Lady Julia Percy Island, Henri and his friends Dietmar Krupa and Fred Arndt were talking about a terrifying tale. It wasn't exactly something the usual crowd would talk about right before diving into the ocean and putting themselves at the mercy of the waves. The terrifying tale was about a massive great white shark meandering about in the surrounding area. It was called Big Ben. Although there is hardly any truth to most monster tales such as this, it was not hard to believe in this one at this time, considering the thousands of fur seals one could perceive as far as the eyes could see. Put a man on a boat in the middle of the ocean near a remote island, and you get the perfect ingredients for the most monstrous creature alive, even if only in imagination. However, according to locals who claimed the massive shark was at least 20 feet in length, the creature was very much real, and they had the scars to prove it. For Henri, however, this was merely another exciting opportunity for his portfolio. Henri entered the water at around 12:45 p.m. Swimming in the deep parts, Henri shot a film for an hour or so and came back to the boat around 1:15. Unsatisfied with the first film roll, Henri entered the waters once again. This time, he was accompanied by Dietra and Fred, both of whom were equipped with shorthand spears. Nobody could have predicted they would emerge from this dive forever changed by the events to come. Doing a free dive, the three friends found a group of seals rolling around in the waves. Henri immediately turned to film and focused on a bull seal amongst the harem. Suddenly, the seals turned tail and the energetic waves became quiet. Something was not quite right. However, because of the poor visibility in the water, the divers couldn't quite make out what was happening. They dove deeper, 10 meters down, and hugged the bottom. Still, they couldn't find the seals and realized they had to make an ascension. Henri broke through the surface and his head emerged. However, an incredible force hit him like a freight train the second his head broke the surface. Before he could understand what was happening, Henri knew what attacked him and threw his arms into the air to signal to the other divers. He screamed at the top of his lungs, "Shark!" Suddenly, he was torn through the water with incredible ferocity and was dragged below. He couldn't do anything about it. The water burst into chaos. The force pulling Henri down was so strong his mask and snorkel were ripped off from his face. And then from there, in a split second, he caught a glimpse of the marauding perpetrator. It was a great white shark. It was Big Ben. The creature had latched itself onto his leg. It shook him like a dog shaking someone's old slipper. Henri desperately tried reaching for the creature's eyes, but its large snout was getting in the way. He felt the searing pain of the shark's teeth puncturing his calf as he scrambled his hand across its face. Beyond the pain, there was a more pressing matter. Henri was drowning. He had been holding his breath for around 45 seconds as the onslaught continued. He was suffocating as the massive creature tugged at him and rolled him from side to side. Henri could remember the conversation he had on the boat about Big Ben. He was filled with fear and desperation. And then suddenly, the tugging and rolling stopped. Henri could almost sense a moment of peace. He swam towards the surface and broke through, gasping for as much air as he could. He groped around his left leg, but it was not there anymore. The shark had torn it away. Despite the immense shock, Henri managed to muster his focus. Dietmar and Fred reached Henri. However, he wasn't out of the woods yet, because the shark was back for more. Gaining a taste for Henri, the creature approached him again, eager for another bite at the defenseless filmmaker. However, Dietmar and Fred fought the beast off using their small hand spears. The shark came back at least 5 times, and each time, Dietmar and Fred fought against it. The creature was so persistent in coming at Henri, the hand spears were warped in the scuffle. Eventually, the dive boat sped towards the commotion. Jill grabbed the safety line, and eventually Henri was brought onto the boat. Henri immediately received first aid on the boat. As he bled profusely, the other divers brought him to the center and swiftly applied a tourniquet to his injury. Even though there were still members on the island, Henri's case was much more urgent. The captain decided to head towards the hospital and come back for the other members of the island later. The captain immediately called for help and a blood transfusion. When they arrived at Port Fairy, there was already an ambulance waiting with a few liters of blood. According to the doctor, Henri lost 3.5 liters of blood in the attack. He was rushed to Warrnambool Hospital. There were 2 main theories that sprung up from the incident. Firstly, according to Dietmar, Henri was petting a dog at the beach and on the boat. The dog's scent was carried over to Henri, prompting the shark to attack him. The other theory was that Henri was wearing a wetsuit lined with the color yellow. According to experts and 2 Australian universities, sharks are colorblind, but they are keenly aware of contrasting objects. Under the murky waters of Lady Julia Percy Island that day, the yellow color markings on Henri's swimsuit would have been a stark contrast to the surrounding waters, possibly attracting the attention of one of the great white sharks. However, many people argue that the chances of being attacked are far less than being lost at sea. After all, bright colors help with getting found by rescue teams. Nevertheless, Henri was attacked viciously despite being surrounded by seals. He was lucky to be alive. Eventually, Henri made a full recovery and was back in the waters after a few weeks. In 1968, he released a documentary called Savage Shadow, where part of the actual footage of the attack and a reenactment was shown. In a later interview, Henri did not hold grudges against the creature. To him, they were simply acting according to their nature. Luckily for Henri, he was surrounded by a group of divers who were highly skilled and trained. Some people aren't so lucky. Additionally, Henri viewed losing his leg as part of his luck, as it helped him survive and be freed from the shark's grasp. But unlike most great white shark attacks performing a test bite, this shark was keen on eating Henri alive as it returned for him 5 separate times. If it wasn't for Henri's friends, he would have certainly met his unfortunate final affliction.
Heather Boswell was working on a 6-month term in the galley of the Discoverer. The Discoverer was a U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration research ship, voyaging 30 nautical miles off Isla Sala y Gomez and 300 miles east of Easter Island. The date was March 23, 1994, and the mood was a joyous one, as the crew had been given a day off. Some crew members decided to sleep in, while a few of the more adventurous members decided to take an open ocean swim. There was a collective cheer as 9 of the crew members stripped off and jumped into the crystal clear water. Among them were Heather Boswell and Phil Buffington. The group swam and snorkeled, enjoying the freedom of the open, balmy waters. 3 other crew members were monitoring the swimmers in the water from a rigid inflatable boat. At the same time, another watched from aboard the Discoverer ship, scanning the open ocean for deep-sea predators. For almost 90 minutes, the 9 were having the time of their lives, somersaulting through the water before someone shouted, "Shark!" Heather and most of the crew brushed it as a joke and continued swimming, but they were wrong. One of the ocean's deadliest predators had its beady eyes set on crew member Phil Buffington. Had Phil not brushed the warning, or at the very least looked beneath the clear waters, he would have seen the 18-foot black shadow of the great white shark below him. The massive beast stealthily sized him before positioning itself just below him, and then it struck. The shark's powerful jaws clamped down on his thigh near the knee and tried to drag him underwater, where it would show him who was boss. Phil was shaken. The shark had caught him completely off guard. Amidst the excruciating pain and fear, he mastered courage and quickly landed a blow on the shark's head, which sent it spiraling away as it let go of his foot. The others saw the incident, and since they didn't want to become this vicious creature's next victim, they quickly began swimming to safety, something they should have done at the very first warning. Again, someone yelled a warning of a shark. This time around, no one was taking any chances with their lives. They swam towards safety, but unfortunately, all did not make it on board, as it was a bit too late for Heather Boswell, who was 25 feet from the rest of the crew. She had wandered too far from the ship. The monitor watching from aboard the ship saw the great white swim toward Boswell. The other crew members, who had already swam to safety, watched as the shark submerged. It then shot up from the depths and, with its massive jaws wide open, grabbed Boswell by the right ankle. A crew member on the rigid inflatable boat threw a broom handle for Boswell to grab, but before Boswell was completely out of the water, and just when they thought that it was over, the great white struck again. The shark sunk its serrated teeth into Boswell's left leg about mid-thigh and then pulled her back into the water. The water around her turned red, colored by her blood. And then suddenly, all went silent. The shark had disappeared under the surface, and Boswell was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, the ocean was dead. Nothing moved. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, a loud splash tore the silence. Boswell wasn't ready to go down without a fight. She had beaten all odds and managed to resurface. The petrified crew members on the boat grabbed her hands as they attempted to pull her on board. Unfortunately for Boswell, the great white still had its sharp teeth deep in her flesh and wasn't ready to let go. What followed was a tug-of-war with the crew trying to free Boswell from the jaws of death. Suddenly, Boswell heard a pop sound and hoped that it was just a dislocation of her leg as the crew managed to pull her onto the safety of the boat. She let out a sigh of relief. She was finally free. Meanwhile, A shark attack warning had already been broadcasted on the Discoverer ship's PA system. A crew member cleaning his pistol after a target practice heard the broadcast and rushed to see what the commotion was all about. He saw the shark swimming towards someone climbing the ship's ladder and without hesitation fired several rounds at the great white. The shark veered away as it swam towards the stern of the ship. The crew member followed it and fired 2 more rounds, and he watched as the shark became motionless. He had killed the monstrous predator. Heather Boswell, who was lying on the boat, trying to catch her breath, was yet to come to the realization of her state. A stinging sensation from her left leg made her look at her thighs, and that was when it dawned on her that her left leg was missing. The pop sound she had heard earlier was the shark parting with her leg. With her brain now processing the information, her nervous system woke from slumber and the pain kicked in. She was hoisted from the inflatable boat to the ship, where a crew member used his belt as a tourniquet. Phil Buffington was immediately escorted below deck as his feet were throbbing in pain. While his injuries were not as fatal as Boswell's, his left thigh had several gashes, while his right knee and thigh had deep puncture wounds. Medics had to sew him with 50 stitches. At the sickbay, Heather Boswell's left leg had been severed mid-thigh. Her right leg had large gashes and puncture wounds. She had lost blood in large volumes and was in a state of shock. By the time she was placed on the bed, she was cold and unresponsive with no heartbeat. The medics immediately administered IV fluids, and shortly a pulse was detected. By evening, she was stable and fairly made it through the night. At 7 a.m. the following day, the crew prepared her for medical evacuation to a medical facility on land. They turned her on her side, ready to shift her to a stretcher, but the 130-pound Boswell was in such a fragile state that she collapsed. The Holter monitor went haywire as she lost all her measurable blood pressure. Her breathing then became shallow, and the medical team immediately repositioned her. They then did CPR and a sternum rub as she slowly resuscitated and restabilized. The medical team from land arrived on the ship and decided the best way to move Boswell was by the rigid inflatable boat. She was placed aboard the boat and then lowered off the ship and onto the water. Boswell was then taken to a local clinic before being transported to Panama, where she underwent surgery at an Army hospital. The crew members, whose quick actions helped save Heather Boswell's life, received awards and medals of honor and bravery. Heather Boswell fully recovered from her puncture wounds, but had to wear a prosthesis on her left leg for the rest of her life. When asked what it is like being eaten by a shark, she noted that it didn't hurt as much as she expected, but felt like a puppy chewing on your finger. Her incredible survival story is by far the most detailed, deadly attack of a great white shark, and was thus no shock that it was featured on the Discovery Channel's Shark Week. Millions of people around the world were amazed by Heather's story of how she narrowly escaped a great white shark attack, as well as her final affliction. The Zhao family had been looking forward to this all week. Bao and Mei were married for over 5 years, and a little over a year ago they welcomed their daughter into the world. Zhao was the apple of her parents' eye, and the little girl shared the attention from her parents with her maternal grandparents. Mei's parents lived close by, and since her husband and father was often busy with work, Mei's mother, An, spent weekends with the couple. An and her granddaughter were inseparable, and Mei did not mind that her mother split her time equally between her own home and the Zhao family's apartment. She was such a great help with the little Jia, and went above and beyond to make the family's lives as easy as possible, with cooking and keeping up with the housework while the young parents worked. So when they booked a family trip to the Beijing Zoo, Mei just automatically bought a ticket for her mother too. The grandmother was thrilled at the invitation. She'd never been to the iconic site either. The Beijing Zoo is one of the biggest in the world, housing an incredibly wide range of animals. pandas, lions, elephants, wild African bucks, lizards, and the fan favorite, Monkey Hill, where there are over 100 rhesus monkeys swinging from the trees. You name it, the Beijing Zoo has it. And they offer a unique experience where visitors can drive their cars through the many acres of land that hold these animals. The zoo does not believe in penning their animals in small and inhumane cages. Instead, they allow them as much freedom as they possibly can, so that they can live their lives out as naturally as possible. The experience is as close to a real safari as you can get outside of Africa. So that morning, the Zhaos loaded their car full of snacks and drinks. However, May was slow to start. She'd woken up feeling a little nauseous. But she wasn't going to miss out on such an amazing family outing, and rescheduling the whole weekend would cost a lot of unnecessary money that the working family couldn't afford to waste. So May stayed at the back with her daughter for the first leg of the ride. After 2 hours, Zhao parked the car in front of the ticket gates. He'd had a late night at work the night before, so May offered to drive them through the first half of the park while he kept her company in the passenger seat, with An taking over her place next to Jia, who was strapped safely into her car seat. May was feeling a little better than she did that morning, and she was sure she'd be fine to take over for most of the ride. Starting at the north entrance, they drove south, stopping first to see the reptile exhibit. Up next were the African animals. Lions, giraffes, and rhinos were all present. Just as their third hour in the park came to an end, they saw the tropical birds and the northern bears. That's around the time that little Jia nodded off. The toddler was long past her nap time, and she was most likely going to be out like a light for the rest of the ride. All in all, the morning had been an enjoyable one, but by noon, May was starting to feel ill again. The heat of the afternoon sun beat down on her, and she went from feeling slightly queasy to feeling downright faint with nausea. Just as they turned into the south wing of the park, entering the tiger enclosure, An noticed her daughter's pale complexion and encouraged her to switch places with Zhao. They were past the halfway point by now, just where May agreed she would ride to. And even May had to admit that it was time to swap places with her husband before the dashboard became painted with the contents of her stomach. None of the occupants of the car had anything else on their minds other than making the change in drivers. It genuinely did not occur to them that they were in any danger at all. Up until this point, all of the animals had been behind sturdy fences or in cages. But in reality, the tiger exhibit and Monkey Hill were the two most popular attractions for a very specific reason. You could drive your car right into the wild animals' enclosures, with only the walls of your metallic vehicle around you for protection. All of the animals were fed on a strict schedule, so they were never hungry enough to pose a serious threat, and armored vehicles were parked with armed personnel inside every few meters or so as an extra precaution. None of the three adults in the car had even seen any stirrings of life in the exhibit just yet. They had driven only a few feet into it before Mel put the car into park. She released her safety belt, opened the door, and got out. Even the two Siberian tigers that were hidden in the trees were taken by surprise. Never in their entire lives of captivity had a human walked so freely amongst them. It was always just cars that drove past, and the zookeepers that threw their meat shares out of those big armored vehicles twice a day, where these animals ever saw any humans at all. Even though they were bred and raised in captivity and never once hunted a day in their lives, the moment they laid eyes on the walking, living creatures stepping out of the car, their primal instincts kicked in, and May was locked into the sights of their yellow eyes. She walked from the driver's side, around the front end of the car, toward the passenger side door. Zhao's safety belt had gotten a little stuck and he was having trouble getting himself out of the harness. Annoyed, May reached the passenger side door and opened it for Zhao, scolding him to hurry up as she did so. It was this sudden burst of noise from May that triggered one of the felines into action. Before now, he was too confused to decide how to react, but the sudden sound that came from the woman wiped all traces of thought from his mind. It turned into every ounce of the wild hunter that it was born to be. racing out of the trees toward the woman's back. Bao saw the tiger first. He uttered a scream, and May turned to what he was looking at behind her, just in time to see the striped black and orange cat speeding toward her. It was so quick that May didn't have any time to react before the beast sank its teeth into her thigh. She did not immediately feel any pain, but she could feel the pressure of its jaws clamping down on her leg and hear the sickening sound of her flesh ripping to shreds between those razor-sharp teeth as it dragged her off her feet. The hunter didn't try to finish May off there. It was smart enough to start dragging her off to the safety of the trees. When it started pulling her, May finally felt the agonizing pain of her muscle being torn from the bone. Screaming and flailing, her struggles made no impact on the swiftly moving beast that had her in its grip. But Bao, suddenly free from his seatbelt, bounded out of the car to the defense of his wife. An, from the back seat, reacted in the same way. When she saw the tiger coming from the trees, she was no longer an old woman. Adrenaline and love drove her from the car, turning her into a woman 30 years younger. She ran after her son-in-law and her screaming daughter. Neither Bao nor An had any idea what they would do when they reached the predator. They only knew that they would fight with every ounce of their being to get May out of there. The tiger that had May in its jaws must have realized this, because he took one look at the pair running toward him and the armored car already speeding toward the tree line, and it knew that it was outnumbered. It unclenched its jaws, leaving May bleeding on the ground, and took off toward the depths of the trees. But the danger was far from over. A second tiger, a female, was hidden behind some bushes, but she had taken a little more time to assess the situation. She had mere seconds to react if she was going to get a kill away from this site before the men in the military vehicle made it the last few meters to the group. Once they arrived, the tiger's chances of a successful hunt went down to 0. The tiger leapt out of the bushes and landed right on top of the smallest and weakest member of the group, and that was the elderly An. Bao was already kneeling beside May, trying to hoist her over his shoulder, but he was having trouble lifting her, so he carried her in both arms instead. He was going to run as fast as he could to get her back to the car, and with May already screaming in his ears, he didn't hear or see the attack on his mother-in-law behind him. An was driven into the ground by the 300-pound animal. The tiger went straight for the jugular, sinking its teeth into An's neck, shoulder, and face. An did not even get the opportunity to yell out. The force that clamped onto her completely crushed her airways and neck and rendered her ability to push air past her vocal cords obsolete. The female tiger saw that the personnel carrier had come to a stop, and half a dozen men carrying firearms rushed out. She heaved the struggling woman toward the trees, but her teeth tore right through An's neck, essentially yanking the older woman free. Bao turned, carrying May in his arms, ready to sprint to their family car, but he stopped short. There were at least 6 men holding weapons running towards them. His mother-in-law lay on the ground. The severed artery in her neck was spouting blood out of her like a fountain, and the orangey blur that was the female tiger shot back into the trees like lightning. The men took May from Bao's arms and loaded An onto a stretcher. An was no longer moving, and even Bao knew that there was nothing anyone could do. She just bled out so fast that she was dead before they even got her into the back of the personnel car beside her injured daughter. Bao followed them in his own car, his daughter still strapped into her car seat, where she had slept through the entire ordeal. Fast forward 8 months later, and May had endured several surgeries. A funeral was held for An. Bao and May still had nightmares, and baby Jia had grown like a weed. But the horrific events of that day, so many months ago, were far from over, because the Zhao family filed a lawsuit against the Beijing Zoo. That first year of recovery and the lawsuit now upon them, the Zhao family were drawn into an incredibly drawn-out lawsuit. It's been almost 7 years, and it's still not completely come to an end. The courts did eventually decide that the zoo had sufficient warning signs set up, and that their armed personnel's quick response was the reason that the entire family did not die on that horrible day. But the Beijing Zoo still had a lot to answer for. In the 3 years that preceded the death of An and the permanent disability that May now has to live with, there were 2 other deadly attacks at the zoo. Both were staff members, and one of the deaths occurred in the very tiger enclosure where An lost her life. The tiger responsible for An's tragic death at Beijing Zoo Park was not euthanized by the zoo. Instead, it remained in an enhanced enclosure away from the public to prevent any other park visitors from meeting their terrifying final affliction. 25-year-old Lauren Failla was living her best life. Originally from New Jersey, USA, she had just finished studying for a master's degree at Sotheby's Institute of Art in London. She was an incredibly talented artist and soprano singer, a kind, warm-hearted individual who had also fallen in love with 24-year-old Hito Chada. His father was born in India, and Hito was eager to show his girlfriend Lauren the country. On the spur of the moment, they planned a trip to the subcontinent. There were some beautiful places to visit, some exquisite architecture, and incredible beaches. One of those beaches was at Havelock Island, in India's remote Andaman Island chain. Lauren saw the trip as a final adventure before settling down. She had received a distinction in her art masters and intended to shift her focus to social care. She was always described as a caring person, someone who would drop everything to lend a helping hand. She had volunteered with bereaved children by offering art classes as a form of therapy. This was, perhaps, something she intended on doing upon returning to the U.S. after her trip to India. She was an active member of the church and was eager to attend a church concert featuring her favorite group, Morristown's Blair Reinhardt Band, just a few days after returning home. But she would never make the concert. Havelock Island, also known as Swaraj Dweep, is home to some 6,000 people and is situated in the Bay of Bengal. It is known for its stunning beaches. Picture-perfect white sands and turquoise blue waters are lined by a backdrop of lush greenery. The most popular beach, Radhanagar Beach, also called Beach Number 7, is situated on the west coast. It was voted the best beach in Asia by Time magazine in 2004. On April 28, 2010, towards the end of their trip across India, Hito and Lauren headed to Beach Number 7 on Havelock Island. It was just past 3 in the afternoon. The conditions were perfect. Hito was an experienced snorkeler and scuba diver. The 2 of them headed down to the water's edge, each carrying with them their masks and snorkels. There was no one else about. It was the perfect romantic getaway. They paddled into the water, wading in up to their waists. Then they pulled their masks over their faces and dived into the blue. The shallows opened out to a reef, and the 2 of them swam along the corals, pointing out the brightly colored fish darting about beneath them. The water was clear. It was warm. Hito was filming the snorkel with his underwater camera. Whilst the beach was deserted, the couple weren't alone. A predator was moving silently closer, though not one you would expect to find out in the open water. It ducked beneath the surface, holding its breath as it swayed its tail from side to side, propelling it through the Indian Ocean. A crocodile's skin, particularly on the head, is covered in pressure sensors known as integumentary sensory organs. These enable the animal to detect surface pressure waves from a long way off. This particular crocodile could sense the presence of Lauren and Hito along the reef. It was on the hunt for a meal. It made a beeline directly for the young couple, drawn to their movements, the vibrations from their splashes and their voices above the water's surface. Lauren and Hito headed towards a cove along the shore. As they swam along, Lauren suddenly felt something sharp grab hold of her leg. It yanked her backwards, and she immediately thought that it was a shark. She cried out in alarm, and she was violently dragged through the water. She instinctively reached down to try and pull her leg free. Hito turned around to see a flash of dark green and gray swirl around Lauren. Bubbles exploded around her as she wrestled with an enormous creature. Hito could see a long, scaly body and a powerful tail thrashing above his head. His eyes were wide as he realized that a 12-foot crocodile had hold of his girlfriend by her leg. He immediately leapt into action, He didn't think about his own safety. He charged towards Lauren and the crocodile and tried to grab it. He instinctively let go of his camera. The video kept rolling as it tumbled to the water column and rested on the seabed, capturing a few seconds of the horrific ordeal. The crocodile had Lauren firmly in its powerful jaws. Hito tried to hit it repeatedly. He tried to wrestle with it, finding its eyes and poking it, but it was too powerful. It was like hitting an armored truck. No amount of force seemed to make the slightest bit of difference. Lauren was fighting for breath. She was desperately trying to make a break for the surface, but the enormous reptile held her under the water, pulling her downwards. It had taken her completely by surprise. She hadn't taken in a deep lungful of air to prepare for the battle. Instead, she felt her lungs burning as she was dragged away from the surface. She was losing the fight. Then the crocodile pulled her away from the reef and out to sea. Hito watched, horrified, as his girlfriend was carried away by the cold-blooded predator. He tried to swim after them, but they had disappeared from sight. Instead, he swam frantically back to the beach to search for help. In the shallows, he screamed for help and half-tripped, half-sprinted out of the water, across the beach into the nearby resort. Emergency services were deployed to the beach, and a search for Lauren ensued, but there was no sign of her. There was no sign of a struggle or of any remains or torn clothing that could verify Hito's version of events. With Lauren missing, the police grew suspicious of Hito and his story. Here was a young man in a secluded spot who was claiming that a crocodile had taken his girlfriend. It was a beach that had never seen crocodiles before. Hito was hauled off to the police station where the officers began to interrogate him. Hito was oblivious to their suspicions. All he could think about was Lauren and her family. It wasn't until the next day that a diver found Hito's camera on the seafloor by the reef. The camera was still working, and it was immediately inspected by police officers. They rewound the footage, and to their absolute horror, they could see that Hito had been telling the truth. As the camera had sunk to the bottom of the sea, it had captured glimpses of an enormous crocodile attacking Lauren. To their surprise, it also depicted Hito as the hero. When they replayed the footage over and over, trying to make sense of the attack, they could see the young man rushing over to Lauren and wrestling with the 12-foot reptile in an attempt to save his girlfriend. That footage was a lifesaver for Hito, but his heart was about to be torn to pieces as 2 days after the incident, authorities found Lauren's remains a short distance from the cove. She had been killed by the crocodile, and her body washed ashore. Both locals and tourists were shocked when the news of Lauren's tragedy spread. The beach was incredibly popular. It was one of the most beautiful beaches on the island and frequented by swimmers and snorkelers. Nobody had ever seen a crocodile there before. Nobody knew that they posed a risk until that moment. It was truly heartbreaking that it had happened to a young woman who was on holiday, having the best time of her life. The nearest crocodile sanctuary was Lohabarak Crocodile Sanctuary, located about 45 sea miles from where Lauren was attacked. There had never been any reports of escaped crocodiles, but in the search for Lauren, authorities came across 4 in the area. The local government were playing with people's lives. There was no signage to indicate that there could potentially be crocodiles in the water near beach number 7. This was something that Lauren's family was furious about. There was no way she would have entered the water if there was even the remotest chance of a crocodile being nearby. Lauren's death hit the family hard, like it would with anyone who lost somebody so young. But for them, it was almost too much to bear. Only 4 years before, in 2006, Lauren's parents, Frank and Kay, lost their eldest daughter, Emily, in a tragic rock climbing accident. She had been 24, 1 year younger than Lauren. Now both girls were gone, and both from tragic accidents, simply from being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Although it was no comfort to Lauren's family, her attack had been incredibly rare. In fact, it was thought that it was the first open water attack by a crocodile in the Andaman Islands in history. In the past quarter century, there had only been 24 crocodile attacks, with 4 of them being fatal. These were typically in the mangrove areas or inland swamps of the island, habitats which were typical for crocodiles. Just 2 days before the incident, Lauren had emailed one of her longtime childhood friends. It was clear from her message that she was having the time of her life. But, as was so typical of Lauren, she was also thinking about others and one of her best friends who was expecting her first baby. The message read, "Having an awesome and epic and hectic time in India. I miss you loads and wanted to wish you a happy, healthy anniversary. You rock my socks off." Tragically, by the time she had read Lauren's message, she had already met her horrifying final affliction. The case we're going to cover today is an enigma, a mystery, because even though 3 people in total were attacked, we still don't know exactly what animal it was that is to blame. It all started off the coast of Mexico, just as the December of 2023 began. 26-year-old Maria Jimenez was killed by a shark while swimming with her friends and family. We can be certain that it was a shark because there were witnesses to the attack, but the species is still unknown. Less than a week later, 500 miles away, in the Ixtapa-Zihuatanejo resort, 2 attacks, just 2 days apart, took place. With Maria's death still hot in the news, and the fact that the attacks happened in the ocean, it was just assumed that it was a shark too, probably the same one that killed Maria. But that might not be the case at all. The first attack at Ixtapa occurred when another young woman was swimming. Basking in the shallows, she was grabbed by the leg under the cloudy water. The other holiday-goers grabbed her arms when she began screaming in pain, and they saw the crimson water. Whatever grabbed her did so much damage that doctors briefly considered amputating the leg entirely, but luckily they were able to patch up her shattered and torn leg. When she woke up, she remembered something very important. Even though she hadn't seen what had bitten her, she was adamant that this was no shark. When the creature rammed into her, it felt like it was made of jagged rock, not at all the hard or leathery skin that sharks have. Her hands showed the evidence of the sharp edges that she'd managed to grab onto during the brief struggle. They were scratched and raw. Sharks have smooth skin, but crocodiles, well, they resemble rock more than anything else. Their scales aren't as smooth as other reptiles are. Those scales can rip through flesh like a serrated knife would. The doctors who treated her agreed. The bites looked more like a crocodile than a shark, but the leg was so terribly ripped and torn that it was hard to make a definitive call, and crocodiles do sometimes manage to make it into the salt water. Heavy rains and plain old bad luck lead the fearsome lizards into the ocean, though they almost always make it back to the freshwater streams in a few days. Confused and out of place, they rarely hunt in the salt water, but it wouldn't be the first time that they did. Or it could have been the Morales crocodiles, a very unique species of crocodile that have adapted to living in the salt waters of Mexico. These beasts don't grow as large as their freshwater cousins, but their snouts are broader, their bite is stronger, and they run faster on land, making them every bit as dangerous as the other species, and in some ways, even more so. And now we get to the 14th of December, with most people still thinking it was a shark that attacked the unnamed woman, thanks to Maria's death just a few days before. But the news of the second victim hadn't spread quite as far and wide as aquatic attacks usually do. The woman survived. Witnesses couldn't define what creature had attacked her, and subsequently, with so little to go on, there just wasn't as much publicity as there should have been. That day, a Belgian tourist named Joseph Bynens, aged 75, was swimming lazily off in the distance. The late morning was warm, and almost everyone had gotten out of the water to avoid the direct heat of the midday sun that was fast approaching. Marlene Luviano was one of those that decided to stay on the beach, playing at the edges of the waves with her 3-year-old daughter. Marlene and her father had taken the little girl to the resort to celebrate her birthday, since she loved the water so much. And Mr. Luviano was recording every moment on his cell phone. Just ahead of the happy little family, Joseph was still taking his leisurely swim, and he crossed into Mr. Luviano's video footage. Joseph felt a sudden snap around his calf and knee. Before he could even register what was happening, he was pulled under the water, but the bite was shallow and the animal's teeth ripped through Joseph's flesh, allowing him to break free and surface again. Joseph managed to scream. The sound was muted by the water that had flooded into his mouth, but it was enough for the Luvianos to look up from their game. Mr. Luviano had caught Joseph's sudden submersion, his reappearance, and his desperate cry for help on camera. Just as Marlene pulled her daughter away from the danger and her father turned off the camera, the beachgoers swarmed into the water to help the elderly man in distress. They thought he had gotten tired and was in danger of drowning, but when he disappeared beneath the surf again, yanked like a string, and the bloody redness that took his place in the waves, they knew that this was no drowning. This was something much, much worse. The splashing of the approaching horde of no less than 8 men rushing to the scene made the animal release its hold on Joseph's leg. It sank down deep and fled back into the safety of the deeper ocean. The crowd pulled Joseph out, but it was too late. In less than a minute, he'd been bitten twice. The second strike was so fierce that what little was left of his right leg was hanging on by a few strands of sinew. By the time he was carried out onto the sand, the severed leg wasn't even bleeding anymore. There simply was no more blood left in him to spend. Just 50 seconds was all it took to take Joseph's life, with all of his life's blood spilled from his body. No amount of CPR, transfusions, or anything that the paramedics did on their way to the hospital. Nothing could bring him back, no matter how quickly they arrived or how hard they tried. Joseph was gone, and all he left behind was the video evidence of just how quickly and silently a person can be taken from this world by the monsters that live beneath the surface. And if you're wondering, the creature hasn't struck since, further deepening the belief that it was indeed a saltwater crocodile. Sharks have a habit of coming back to good hunting grounds, while the aquatic lizards are not so bound to a single place. If the hunting isn't fruitful enough, they'll move on. And Joseph's wounds, too, were consistent with a crocodile bite that could not have been less than 3 meters long. It's still out there somewhere, waiting to bring another unsuspecting swimmer to their terrifying final affliction. Mike Hodge and his wife Chrissy moved to South Africa 30 years ago, all to pursue Mike's passion for the magnificent African wildlife. Mike specialized in the most fearsome of them all, the mighty African lion. In less than 10 years, Mike and Chrissy overhauled their little oasis in the bush into a sanctuary where injured lions, abandoned cubs, and a fair number of other wildlife found their permanent home. Marakele Animal Sanctuary wasn't just known for its game drives and regular old African safari-style entertainment. Mike and Chrissy had lions, cheetahs, and leopards right in the heart of the property. Some of the animals brought in were so injured when they were found that they'd never survive on their own in the wild. But thanks to Mike and Chrissy, they were held in massive enclosures so that they could live long and healthy lives as close to their original environments as possible. Mike was never in the business of raising circus animals who'd do backflips for a treat. He understood the nature of a wild animal better than anyone. Even the cubs that they raised by hand were never left alone with other humans. And whenever Mike or his staff entered an enclosure, even as friendly as the lions were, someone always had a loaded hunting rifle at the ready, just in case. And for the more sensitive of our viewers, this rather extreme precaution amongst seemingly tame kittens was what ultimately saved Mike's life. His playful cats that he'd fed in the night and raised on his lap were never underestimated, and guests were allowed to view them but never feed or interact personally with the predators, just like it would have been in the wild. The only real difference here was that the cats were supplied food by the staff, and with the high fence line, visitors could view them closer than they would have on a game drive out in the wild. Shamba, the biggest of Mike's captive lions, was the main attraction for everyone. He was found as the lone surviving cub of his litter, his mother probably killed by another predator. Between Mike and Chrissy, they fed Shamba bottles by hand and allowed him to sleep on their laps so that he wouldn't mewl and cry in the night for his lost siblings and mother. Mike liked to entertain visitors by going into Shamba's enclosure and feeding him by hand and showing them how the mighty beast loved a scratch behind the ears. This was exactly the case on May 2nd, 2018. Mike and his wife were now in their early 70s, and at a time when most people would have long since retired, they were still going strong and accepting more guests than ever. Chrissy had received a group of 3 married couples, all in their late 30s, from America the night before. The group were planning on spending the next 2 days exploring the reserve and shaking off their jet lag. After a good night's sleep, Mike and his best tour guide, Lubanzi, took the group out bright and early. Lubanzi noticed that Shamba was not his usual self, and the guide, an expert in his field, thought he knew what it was. Inside Shamba's enclosure there was the unmistakable musk left behind by a badger. Apparently, the ferocious little beast had gotten into the lion's space the night before and left its scent everywhere that it could reach. Lubanzi used Shamba's breakfast to keep the lion's attention occupied elsewhere so that he could try to find the badger, but apparently the animal had gone off to find someone else to terrorize. He reported his suspicions to Mike, but besides Shamba being a little on edge, there wasn't much else they could do until they caught and relocated the badger. They drove the armored jeep, spotting out the various bucks, elephants, and even a herd of zebras. The morning was everything that an African safari promised to be on the brochures. After a quick lunch under the canopy of the trees, the group was taken to the fenced-in enclosures where the permanent rescues stayed, starting with a pair of springbuck babies that were being fed milk from handheld bottles. They worked their way up to the more exotic creatures, including 2 cheetahs and a mean-tempered serval cat who wasn't willing to come out to greet them. They ended the ride with a visit to Shamba's enclosure, where Mike got out and confidently entered through the high gates. Lubanzi followed, his rifle slung over his shoulder, as was protocol. The couples had been eagerly awaiting this part of the trip all day. Shamba's reputation was legendary, and Mike's handling of him was nothing short of awe-inspiring. Unlike every other visit, Shamba did not bound over to Mike with excitement. Instead, he had his nose on the ground, still sniffing at the musk that last night's intruder had left behind. When Mike walked up to him, Shamba didn't see his old friend. He was in the throes of being territorial. He was defensive and already poised for a fight. Shamba just leapt at him, and Mike recognized immediately that the growls and the sudden spring was uncharacteristic. He bolted for the gate as fast as his geriatric legs could carry him. Had he been a few years younger, he'd have made it the short distance to the gate, but he was not a young man anymore. Shamba outstripped him almost instantly, ramming full force into Mike just as he reached out for the gate. The American started screaming in panic and fear. Lubanzi, on the other hand, had his rifle out and at the ready before Mike even reached the gate. He didn't dare fire at Shamba just yet, for fear of hitting Mike. Shamba hooked the elderly man with his claws, pulled Mike away from the gate that he was hanging onto for dear life, and dragged him across the ground. Mike went limp, not because fear had incapacitated him, but because he knew better than to put up a fight. If he reacted now, Shamba would retaliate to any sudden movement with murderous finality. So despite the burning pain in his jaw and the searing wounds on his back, Mike allowed himself to be dragged like a rag doll a few feet away, not even daring to yell out in pain. If he could scream, it would have been to tell the tourists to keep quiet. Their terrified yells and one of the women's hysterical crying were surely driving Shamba to even greater fury. The explosion of noise was just adding to the chaos. Lubanzi fired a round into the air, and Shamba was shaken out of his moment of madness for just long enough to let go of Mike. And still, Mike didn't move, but neither did Shamba. He stood over Mike like a predator guarding a kill, ready to square off with whoever fired the round. Lubanzi didn't need to take a second to decide. With Mike on the ground and finally out of Shamba's jaws, this was going to be the only chance Lubanzi had to save his boss's life. A second of hesitation was all that Shamba needed to finish Mike off, so Lubanzi fired the second round, hitting Shamba squarely in the chest. The lion bounded back from Mike, running around in a half circle, thoroughly confused at the sting in his chest, not realizing that he was mortally wounded. But the damage was done. The lion, now mad with pain, added to its already uncontrollable territorial instinct. It was a time bomb waiting to happen. Lubanzi took a moment to see if Mike was even still alive, but Mike was lying still as death. He turned back and fired 2 more shots. Shamba stumbled a few feet backwards, reeling from the blast, and fell dead on the ground. With the screams and yells still ringing in his ears, Lubanzi stepped into the enclosure, his rifle still raised in case Shamba wasn't as dead as he seemed, while another guide ran in after him and dragged Mike out by his armpits. Miraculously, Mike was conscious, and he even directed his staff on calling emergency services and on how to evacuate the traumatized tourists. To them, Mike looked like he was at death's door. The man was bleeding profusely from the grooves left by Shamba's claws in his back, and his jaw was very clearly broken. It was a wonder that Mike could even manage to talk. He was airlifted to Johannesburg within the hour, while Chrissy drove the couples to a local hotel. The visitors wanted nothing more than to get away from the sanctuary after their ordeal. Mike, accompanied by Lubanzi and his stepdaughter, waited all day to see him out of surgery. Mike, like he always had, just powered through it all. Besides his jaw being broken in 2 places from being rammed into the metallic gate, he had a dozen scratches that required more than 100 stitches. You'd think that Mike would call it a day and finally retire, but no. The Hodge family are still there, rescuing and raising the very predators that nearly took Mike's life. If anything, the sanctuary, the Hodges, and the staff mourned the loss of Shamba. They'd seen him grow up before their eyes, and they knew better than anyone that a wild animal will always be just that, wild. No one blamed Shamba, but Lubanzi did blame himself. He's never quite gotten over killing the king of the jungle. As thankful as he was that Mike could live to save another animal, he can't stop replaying the memory of Shamba's terrifying final affliction.